The law office smelled of old leather and paper dust. Clara Whitfield sat in the farthest chair from the conference table, her hands folded tight in her lap, her fingers pressing hard against her own knuckles until the skin went white. She had driven 3 hours from her apartment in Dayton to be here. 3 hours of empty highway and gray October sky and memories she could not stop from flooding through her mind like water through a cracked dam. Grandpa Walter had been dead for 11 days. 11 days since the phone call. 11 days since she had pulled her car to the side of the road and sat there with the engine running and her forehead against the steering wheel, unable to breathe. 11 days since the world had become a place without Walter Grayson in it, and Clara still had not figured out how to live in that world. She was not sure she wanted to. The lawyer was a man named Frank Harmon. He had thin white hair combed neatly to one side, and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had spent 40 years handling other people's grief. He wore a dark suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning, and a tie the color of a winter sky. He opened the leather folder in front of him and began to read. The Last Will and Testament of Walter Raymond Grayson. Clara watched her cousins lean forward in their chairs. Diane, the eldest, at 48, sat closest to the lawyer with her reading glasses perched on her nose and her hands folded on the table as though she were attending a board meeting. Tom, 45, sat beside her with his legs spread wide and one arm draped over the back of his chair, projecting a casualness that did not reach his eyes. Brenda, the youngest at 40, sat near the window scrolling through her phone, glancing up only when the lawyer's voice rose above a murmur. To my granddaughter, Diane, Frank Harmon read, I leave the farmhouse and all its contents, 3 stories of Victorian architecture, original woodwork, and stained glass sitting on 2 acres atop the hill above the soybean fields. Clara watched Diane's eyes go bright with satisfaction. She touched the pearl necklace at her throat and nodded slowly as though this was exactly what she had expected, as though the universe had finally confirmed what she had always believed about her place in the family. To my grandson Tom, I leave the 100 acres of farmland east of County Road 9, including all mineral and water rights. Tom leaned back and let out a slow, controlled breath through his nose. 100 acres of prime Indiana farmland, black soil that had been producing corn and soybeans for 100 years. At current prices, the land alone was worth close to $2 million. To my granddaughter Brenda, I leave the John Deere 8430 tractor and all associated working equipment currently housed in the main barn. Brenda looked up from her phone and smiled. The tractor was worth $300,000. The associated equipment added another $100,000 on top of that. Then Frank Harmon adjusted his reading glasses, turned to the final page of the document, and paused. It was a brief pause, barely noticeable, but Clara saw it. A hesitation in his professional composure, as though he knew what was coming and was bracing himself for the reaction. To my granddaughter Clara, I leave the old International Harvester combine in the back field behind the east barn. The room went still, not the comfortable stillness of satisfaction that had followed the other bequests, but a sharp, sudden silence. The kind of silence that follows a slap. Tom was the first to break it. He snorted, a single involuntary sound that came out before he could stop it. That rust bucket. He looked at Clara with an expression that hovered between amusement and genuine pity. That thing hasn't run since the 80s, Clara. It's been sitting out there in the weeds so long, the birds are nesting in the engine block. Diane shook her head slowly. The motion was sympathetic, maternal, and entirely condescending. I'm sorry, Clara. Maybe we can help you get a few $100s for the scrap metal. There's a yard in Lafayette that takes old farm equipment. Brenda said nothing. She just looked down at her phone again, already texting someone about the tractor. Clara forced a smile. Her jaw ached from the effort. After 30 years. 30 years of driving out to the farm every summer, every harvest season, every holiday she could manage. 30 years of waking up before dawn to help Grandpa Walter with the fields. Of riding on the tractor beside him while he explained the soil composition of every acre. Of sitting on the farmhouse porch in the evening, listening to his stories about the old days, about the Depression, about the war his father fought in, about the machines that changed agriculture forever. Of being the only grandchild who actually came when he called. The only one who showed up when the barn roof leaked or the well pump broke or the loneliness got so heavy that he needed the sound of another person's voice just to remember he was still alive. And this was what she meant to him. A broken down machine that everyone called an eyesore. Frank Harmon cleared his throat. There is also this. He reached into the leather folder and produced a sealed envelope. It was cream-colored, slightly wrinkled, and Clara's name was written across the front in Grandpa Walter's handwriting. The letters trembled with age but were legible. Clara. She took the envelope. Her cousins were already standing, already moving toward the door, already talking about property lines and renovation plans and equipment, maintenance schedules, and the thousand practical details of inheriting a life's work. Nobody noticed Clara slip the envelope into her jacket pocket. Nobody was looking at her at all. Outside, the October air was sharp enough to sting. The farm spread out before her in every direction, fat and rolling and impossibly familiar. Golden stubble fields running to the dark tree line. The farmhouse sitting white and tall on its hill, its Victorian gables catching the afternoon light. The barns and silos and fence lines that Grandpa Walter had maintained for 60 years with the same meticulous care he gave to everything he touched. And there, far off behind the east barn, barely visible above the tall brown grass, the combine. A massive red shape faded by decades of sun and rain and snow, sitting alone in the field like something the world had forgotten about. Like something that was waiting. "Don't worry about it, Clara," Brenda said, catching up to her in the gravel parking lot. Her voice was cheerful, breezy, the voice of someone who has gotten what she wanted and can now afford to be generous with her sympathy. "At least you got something right," Clara nodded. She got into her truck and closed the door. Through the windshield, she could still see the combine, a ghost of red metal in a sea of dying grass. She sat there for a long time, her hands on the steering wheel, not moving. Then she pulled out the envelope. Her hands were trembling as she tore it open. The note inside was written on a single sheet of lined paper, the kind Grandpa Walter used to tear from the yellow legal pad he kept beside his recliner. His handwriting was shaky but clear. Each letter formed with the deliberate care of a man who understood that these might be the last words he ever wrote. Clara, it read, "Don't let them see you cry over this old machine. She's got more secrets than a politician's diary. Check the grain tank. Look for the loose panel on the left side about chest high. What you find there will change everything. Trust me, girl, your old grandpa knew what he was doing. Love, Grandpa Walter." She read it 3 times. Then she read it again, her lips moving silently over the words. The grain tank. She had climbed all over that combine as a child, had played in its enormous shadow on summer afternoons, had sat in the cracked leather driver's seat, pretending to harvest fields that stretched all the way to the edge of the world. But she had never noticed any loose panels. She had never been told to look for one. That evening she waited. She waited until the lights in the farmhouse went on warm and yellow against the darkening sky. She waited until the sound of her cousin's celebration carried across the fields on the cold October air. Music and laughter and the clink of glasses and the muffled sound of Tom's voice raised in a toast. They were celebrating their inheritance. They were dividing up a dead man's life and calling it a party. Clara drove back to the farm with her headlights off for the last quarter mile. The road was empty and the darkness was absolute except for the stars. She parked behind the east barn, where her truck could not be seen from the house, and sat for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The combine loomed above her when she stepped out. Enormous and still and silent, its silhouette cutting a jagged line against the starfield. Up close in the darkness, it looked less like a machine and more like a monument, something ancient and patient and full of purpose. She pulled a flashlight from the glove compartment and walked around to the left side of the grain tank. The machine looked even worse up close than it did from a distance. Rust had eaten through parts of the outer panels in irregular brown patches that looked like continents on a map. Weeds grew up through the gaps in the chassis, their dry stalks rattling in the night breeze. Something small and fast moved in the darkness beneath the header, a field mouse or a rat, and Clara flinched before steadying herself. The flashlight beam swept across the metal. Most of the panels on the grain tank were welded in place, their edges sealed by decades of oxidation into a single continuous surface of rusted steel. But one panel about chest height on the left side, exactly where Grandpa Walter had said, looked different from the others. The rust pattern was wrong. It was too uniform, too controlled, as if someone had applied a chemical treatment to make the surface look old. And when Clara pressed her palm flat against the metal, the panel gave slightly. A fraction of an inch, but enough to feel the movement under her hand. This panel was not welded, it was floating. Clara went back to her truck for a screwdriver. She worked around the edges of the panel carefully, methodically, her breath visible in the cold night air, her fingers stiffening in the chill. The panel was held in place by hidden clips, precision machine clips, that were nothing like the crude industrial fasteners on the rest of the machine. These were the work of a man with an engineering background, a man who knew how to build things that looked permanent but could be opened by someone who knew where to press. After 10 minutes of careful prying, the panel popped free. Behind it was a cavity in the machine's body, a space that should not have been there, carved out of the structural framework with precision tools. Inside the cavity was a metal box about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in thick plastic sheeting and sealed with industrial-grade waterproof tape. The wrapping was professional, meticulous. However long this box had been hidden in the belly of the machine, whatever was inside had been protected from moisture, from temperature changes, from the slow decay of time. Clara pulled it out. It was heavy in her hands, solid. She held it against her chest and looked back toward the farmhouse. The lights were still on. The music was still playing. She could hear the distant sound of Tom's laughter carrying across the night. She carried the box to her truck and drove away. Back at her apartment in Dayton, Clara sat at her kitchen table under the harsh overhead light. The sealed box sat in front of her. The kitchen was small, the counters cluttered, the faucet dripping with a steady rhythm that she had stopped hearing years ago. This was her life. A two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building that smelled of other people's cooking. A parking spot that faced a dumpster. A stack of bills on the counter that she sorted every Sunday night into categories of urgency. She cut through the plastic wrapping with a kitchen knife. Inside was a metal document box with a combination lock, the kind sold at office supply stores for keeping important papers. Taped to the top was another note in Grandpa Walter's handwriting. The combination is the day you turn 16. You will remember. She closed her eyes. 16, the summer of 2001, July 15th, the day Grandpa Walter took her out to the back 40 in the old Ford pickup truck and let her drive for the first time. She had been terrified and thrilled in equal measure, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles went white, her foot trembling on the gas pedal. He had laughed that deep, warm laugh that started in his chest and rumbled up through his throat, and he had put his weathered hand over hers on the wheel and said, "You are braver than you think, Clara. You always have been." 071589. The lock clicked open. Inside were documents, photographs, official-looking certificates with raised seals in formal language, and sitting on top of everything, a letter addressed to Clara. The letter was dated just 3 months before Grandpa Walter died. Clara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you found my little treasure hunt. What you are about to discover will shock you, but I need you to understand the whole story before you do anything. Beneath the letter was a certificate of authenticity from the Smithsonian Institution. The document was printed on heavy cotton paper with the Smithsonian seal embossed in gold. Clara read the formal language twice before the meaning assembled itself in her mind. This certificate confirms that the International Harvester Model 1480 Combined Harvester Serial Number IH-1480-001 is the original prototype unit manufactured in 1975. This machine is the first combine to incorporate the axial flow rotary threshing system and represents a pivotal innovation in agricultural technology. Her fingers went numb. The room seemed to contract around her, the walls pulling inward, the ceiling pressing down and then expanding again, as the meaning of what she was reading flooded through her. She picked up the next document with hands that would not stop shaking. It was an appraisal from Dr. Ruth Bellamy, identified in the letterhead as one of the foremost specialists in vintage agricultural equipment in North America. The appraisal was dated 2 years ago and ran to 6 pages of detailed analysis. The estimated value was printed in bold type at the bottom of the final page. $12 to $15 million. Clara read the number. She blinked. She read it again. She pushed her chair back from the table and stood up so fast that the chair tipped over and hit the floor with a crack that she did not hear. She paced to the window and back. She sat down in the overturned chair, which she did not bother to write. She picked up the appraisal again and held it directly under the light, tilting it back and forth, looking for some sign that it was a joke, a forgery, a senile old man's fantasy committed to paper by a disreputable appraiser. It was none of those things. The letterhead was real. The credentials were verifiable. The language was precise and professional. Clara set down the appraisal and turned back to Grandpa Walter's letter. It continued for 3 full pages, written in his steady, deliberate hand, the handwriting of a man who had been trained as an engineer and never lost the habit of precision. In 1975, he wrote, "I was not just a farmer. I was a test engineer for International Harvester's new combine development program. The company selected me because of my engineering degree from Purdue and my reputation among Indiana farmers for careful, detailed mechanical work. I had been consulting with their design team for 2 years before they built the first production unit. They gave me the very first machine off the line, serial number 001, the prototype. I tested it for 2 full growing seasons on my own fields, documenting every performance metric, every mechanical issue, every potential improvement. I sent them weekly reports filled with engineering data and field observations. I suggested modifications that ended up in the final production design. 3 of my ideas are still used in combines manufactured today. When the testing period was complete and they were satisfied with the design, they asked for the machine back. They wanted to put it in their corporate museum in Chicago. But I had grown attached to that combine, Clara. It had helped me save the farm during the hard years of the late 70s when commodity prices crashed and half the farmers in the county went bankrupt. I had spent 2 seasons inside that machine, learning every bolt and bearing and hydraulic line. It was not just equipment to me, it was a partner. So I made them a deal. I would buy it from them at full retail price, and they could build another unit for their museum. They agreed. They thought I was a sentimental fool for paying full price for a used machine that I had already put 1,000 hours on. Maybe I was, but that combine represented something important to me. It was proof that a farm boy from Indiana could contribute something meaningful to the world. Over the decades, I received calls and letters from collectors and museums wanting to buy it. The offers kept getting larger as vintage agricultural equipment became more collectible. 100,000 in the 80s, 500,000 in the 90s, 1 million by 2005. But I always said no. That machine represented a pivotal moment in agricultural history, and I wanted it to stay in the family. But I also knew that not all of my grandchildren would understand its true value. Some of them would see dollar signs and nothing else. They would sell it to the first buyer who waved a check, and the money would be spent within a year on things that did not matter. You are different, Clara. You understand that some things are worth more than money. You always have. Clara set down the letter and walked to her apartment window. The city lights of Dayton spread out below her in a grid of street lights and headlights in the distant amber glow of the interstate. Somewhere out there in the Indiana darkness, 70 miles to the west, a rusted red machine sat in an overgrown field, keeping a secret that was worth more than everything else Grandpa Walter had left behind combined. She could not sleep. She sat at her laptop until 3 in the morning, her eyes burning, researching everything she could find about prototype farm equipment, vintage machinery, auctions, and the history of International Harvester. What she found made Dr. Bellamy's appraisal seem conservative. A 1970 prototype John Deere combine had sold at a Sotheby's auction in 2019 for $8 million. A one-of-a-kind Alice Chalmers experimental model from 1968 had brought in $6 million at Christie's just the previous year. But those machines, while rare and historically interesting, were less significant than what Clara now owned. The International Harvester 14800 had revolutionized agriculture. It was the first combine ever built to feature the axial flow rotary threshing system, a technology so superior to the conventional design that it became the worldwide industry standard within a decade. Every modern combine harvester on every farm on every continent could trace its mechanical lineage back to this single machine sitting in Grandpa Walter's field. Clara found articles about it in farming trade journals from the 1970s, written when the technology was new and the agricultural world was still absorbing its implications. She found technical papers published by Purdue University analyzing the machine's innovations in mathematical detail. She found a documentary on the History Channel that described the IH-1480 as the machine that changed how the world eats. And she found something that made the machine exponentially more valuable. International Harvester had gone out of business in 1985, its assets absorbed through a series of mergers and acquisitions that dissolved the company into history. The brand no longer existed. The factories were closed or converted. The corporate museum in Chicago had been dismantled decades ago, its contents scattered to private collectors and university archives. There was no corporate entity to preserve the legacy, no company museum to house the artifacts. The prototype combine in Grandpa Walter's field was quite possibly the most significant surviving piece of international harvester engineering in existence, the last physical link to a revolution in how the world fed itself. Clara called in sick to work the next morning. She drove back to the farm at dawn and arriving as the first gray lights spread across the flatlands and turned the stubble fields silver. She needed to see the combine again. She needed to look at it with new eyes. She walked around it slowly in the early light. Details she had missed before emerged from the rust and neglect. The serial number plate was still bolted to the lower frame, tarnished to a deep brown but legible when she rubbed it with her thumb. IH-1480-001. The original International Harvester logos were faded but recognizable on both sides of the grain tank, ghostly red outlines against the oxidized metal. The revolutionary axial flow rotor housing was intact beneath the surface rust, its distinctive cylindrical shape visible through the gaps in the side panels. She crouched down and looked at the undercarriage. The drivetrain components were shielded by heavy steel housings that had protected them from the worst of the weathering. The hydraulic lines, while stiff with age, showed no signs of catastrophic failure. The tires were flat and cracked, but the rims were solid. Even in its deteriorated state, the machine's engineering significance was apparent to someone who now understood what they were looking at. Every angle, every component, placement, every structural decision spoke of innovation, of engineers solving problems that had never been solved before, of a moment in time when American ingenuity produced something that would reshape an entire industry. This was not just old farm equipment. This was a monument. You have been spending a lot of time with it, that old rust bucket. Clara straightened up and turned around. Tom was walking toward her across the field, a coffee mug in one hand, his boots leaving dark prints in the frost-covered grass. His breath made clouds in the cold morning air. "Just trying to figure out what to do with it," she said, keeping her voice level and her face carefully blank. He laughed. "Clara, that thing would cost more to restore than it is worth. It's a lawn ornament at best. Why don't you just let me call the scrap yard? I know a guy in Lafayette who will give you $500 for the metal. Cash. This week. I'm not ready to scrap it yet. Come on, be practical." He kicked at one of the massive tires and a piece of dried mud broke free and crumbled on the frozen ground. "This thing is taking up space I need. I'm planning to build grain bins on this section in the spring, and I can't do that with this dinosaur sitting here." Diane appeared behind Tom, carrying her own coffee in a ceramic mug from the farmhouse kitchen. She was wearing a quilted jacket and the expression of a woman who has already decided how a conversation should end. "We were talking last night, Clara. We feel bad about how the will worked out. If you want, we can help you hire a lawyer to contest it." Grandpa obviously was not in his right mind toward the end. Clara felt her jaw clench so hard that her teeth ached. Grandpa was sharp as a tack until the day he died. But this... Tom swept his free hand toward the combine, sloshing coffee onto the frozen ground. "This is just mean, leaving you a broken machine while the rest of us got actual property, actual value. It's like he was trying to hurt you. If only they knew." But Grandpa Walter's letter had been explicit. There was a paragraph near the end written in a hand that pressed harder into the paper than the rest of the letter, as though he was emphasizing the words with physical force. "Do not tell them until you are ready, Clara. Once they know what it is worth, everything will change. And not for the better. I know my grandchildren. I have watched them for 40 years. I love them all. But I trust only you." "I appreciate your concern," Clara said carefully, "but I'm going to hold on to it for now." Tom shrugged. "Your funeral. But that scrap yard offer isn't going to last forever. And I need this field clear by April at the latest." Clara watched them walk back toward the farmhouse, their shoulders close together, their voices low and conspiratorial. She could imagine the conversation. Poor Clara, always the stubborn one, cannot accept reality, holding on to junk out of sentiment just like Grandpa. Maybe being just like Grandpa was precisely the right thing to be. She needed professional confirmation before making any decisions. Using the contact information from the documents in the box, Clara called the number listed for Dr. Ruth Bellamy. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered with a voice like gravel and warm honey. Dr. Bellamy, this is Clara Whitfield. I believe you appraised my grandfather's combine 2 years ago. Walter Grayson. There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. Walter's granddaughter. He told me about you. Told me you were the one with the builder's eye. He was very proud of you, Clara. I was sorry to hear he had passed. He was one of the most remarkable men I have ever met. Could you come out to the farm this Saturday? I need to verify the appraisal and discuss my options going forward. I will be there at 8 in the morning. And Clara, your grandfather made me promise something. He made me promise that if you ever called, I would come immediately. I intend to keep that promise, Doctor. Ruth Bellamy arrived at 7:45. She drove a mud-splattered Ford pickup truck with Pennsylvania plates and a heavy-duty aluminum toolbox bolted to the bed. She stepped out of the cab, and Clara saw a woman of 63 with close-cropped silver hair, no-nonsense brown eyes, and hands that showed decades of work around heavy equipment, calluses on her palms, grease under her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. She wore no jewelry except a wristwatch with a deeply scratched crystal. Her boots were steel-toed and caked with dried mud from some previous farm visit. She shook Clara's hand with a grip that was firm and direct and then turned toward the combine without another word. She approached it the way a surgeon approaches a patient on an operating table. Slowly, methodically, with an intensity of focus that excluded everything else in the world. For 90 minutes, Dr. Bellamy circled the machine. She took photographs from every angle with a professional camera. She made notes in a leather-bound journal, writing in a cramped, precise hand. She crouched beside specific components and examined them with a magnifying glass that she kept on a lanyard around her neck. She measured things with a tape measure. She tested the movement of mechanical components by hand pushing and pulling and rocking parts that had not moved in decades. She scraped rust samples into small plastic bags and labeled them with a marker. Clara followed her at a respectful distance, watching, saying nothing, learning. When Dr. Bellamy finally straightened up and brushed the dirt and rust from her knees, her expression was one of barely contained excitement. Your grandfather was right to keep this quiet, she said. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were alive with something that Clara recognized as the look of a person standing in the presence of something extraordinary. I have been in this field for 30 years, Dr. Bellamy continued. I have appraised over 2,000 pieces of vintage agricultural equipment across North America and Europe. I have authenticated machines for the Smithsonian, for the Henry Ford Museum, for private collections worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I have never in my entire career encountered anything with this level of historical significance. She walked Clara around the machine, pointing out features that no untrained eye would notice. See this rotor assembly? She indicated the cylindrical housing, visible through a gap in the rusted side panel. This exact design became the worldwide standard for every combine harvester manufactured after 1976. International Harvester's competitors spent the better part of a decade trying to reverse engineer what your grandfather helped develop. Alice Chalmers gave up and licensed the technology. John Deere spent $40 million developing their own version. She moved around to the grain handling system. And this is pure innovation. There are elements in this grain flow design that were 20 years ahead of their time, features that did not appear in commercial production until the middle 1990s. Your grandfather's field notes, the ones he sent to International Harvester during the testing period, contained suggestions that predicted developments in combine design that have not been fully implemented even today. Dr. Bellamy ran her hand along the lower frame of the machine with something that resembled reverence. The condition is actually much better than the surface appearance suggests. The rust is primarily cosmetic oxidation on the outer panels. The critical mechanical components, the rotor, the drivetrain, the threshing mechanism, the hydraulic systems are protected by the inner structural housing and are remarkably intact. With proper professional restoration by a qualified vintage machinery firm, this combine could be returned to full working condition. It could harvest a field. She pulled out a tablet computer and showed Clara a slideshow of recent auction results. Photographs of gleaming vintage tractors and combines under the bright lights of major auction houses displayed on elevated platforms with descriptive placards surrounded by well-dressed bidders holding numbered paddles. The prices listed beneath each photograph made Clara's throat go tight. The market for prototype agricultural equipment has exploded in the past 5 years, Dr. Bellamy said. We are seeing interest from demographics that never participated in this market before. Technology billionaires who grew up on farms and feel sentimental about their roots. Industrial museums expanding their collections to attract younger visitors. International buyers from Europe and Asia who view American agricultural innovation as a significant chapter in world history. She closed the tablet and looked at Clara directly. But this machine is in a category by itself. There is nothing else like it in existence. Nothing even remotely comparable. The only other IH-1 480 prototype was destroyed in a factory fire in 1978. This is the sole surviving unit. It is without exaggeration the most historically significant piece of agricultural equipment on the planet. What is your current estimate? Dr. Bellamy did not blink. Conservative estimate, assuming a private sale to a single buyer with no competitive pressure, $12 million. But if you take this to auction at a major international house, if you market it properly, if you generate the kind of media attention this machine deserves, and if you get the right combination of museum representatives and private collectors and institutional buyers competing against each other in a room, she paused and let the pause expand until it filled the space between them. There is no ceiling, Clara. I would not be surprised to see 15 million. I would not be shocked to see 20. Clara felt the earth tilt beneath her feet. Not dramatically, not with any physical sensation she could point to, but in some deeper register. The way the planet shifts in its orbit and nobody feels it happening, except in the slow change of seasons and the gradual lengthening of days. Dr. Bellamy reached into her jacket and produced a business card. On the front was her professional information. On the back, she had handwritten a phone number in blue ink. When you are ready, call the number on the back. That is my personal line. I know exactly which auction house to use, and I have relationships with every major collector and institution in this market. Your grandfather and I discussed this at considerable length. He had a plan, Clara. He planned this very carefully. He had a plan. Dr. Bellamy smiled for the first time. A small, knowing, slightly awed smile. Walter Grayson always had a plan. That was the thing about your grandfather. He was always thinking 3 moves ahead. After Dr. Bellamy drove away, Clara sat in Grandpa Walter's rocking chair on the farmhouse porch. Diane had given her permission to use the porch to sit there whenever she wanted while she figured out what to do with that eyesore of hers. The irony of sitting in the dead man's chair on the dead man's porch, holding the dead man's secret while his other grandchildren drank his wine and rearranged his furniture inside, was not lost on Clara. She reread his letter one more time slowly by the golden light of the setting sun, focusing on the final paragraph. Clara, I am not telling you what to do with this machine. Maybe you will sell it and use the money to build the life you deserve. Lord knows you have earned it. Maybe you will donate it to a museum where people can learn from it and be inspired by it. Maybe you will restore it and keep it running for another generation so some kid like you can climb on it and dream about building things that matter. The choice is yours. But whatever you decide, make sure it is for the right reasons. Money is just a tool, girl. What matters is what you build with it. Clara lowered the letter to her lap and looked out at the farm. The light was changing the way it does in Indiana in October, turning the fields from gold to copper to something darker and richer that has no name. She thought about her life, 43 years old, working as an office administrator at a company that manufactured industrial valves. Sitting in a cubicle for 9 hours a day, processing purchase orders and filing compliance reports for products she had never seen and would never use. Living paycheck to paycheck in a 2-bedroom apartment with a leaky kitchen faucet she could not afford to fix and a parking spot that overlooked a dumpster. She had dreamed once of becoming an architect. She had enrolled in the program at Ohio State, had spent 2 semesters studying design and structural engineering and the way light moved through open spaces. She had been good at it, better than good. Her professors said she had a natural eye for form and proportion, a talent for understanding how structures breathe, how spaces speak, how the angle of a wall or the placement of a window could change the way a person feels when they walk into a room. Then her mother got sick. Breast cancer stage 3, aggressive and merciless. Clara's father had died in a car accident when she was 9 years old. There were no siblings. There was no safety net. There was only Clara. She dropped out of Ohio State at the end of her 2nd semester. She took a job at the valve company because they offered health insurance that would cover her mother's treatment. She spent the next 3 years driving her mother to chemotherapy appointments and radiation sessions, in oncology consultations, in emergency room visits in the middle of the night, when the pain got so bad that even the prescription medication could not hold it back. Her mother survived. After 3 years of treatment, the cancer went into remission. She was alive and grateful, and she told Clara every day that she would find a way to make it up to her. But Clara's savings were gone. Her enrollment at Ohio State had been given to someone else. The momentum of her young life had been broken, and she had never found a way to rebuild it. That was 15 years ago. The dream of architecture had solidified inside her like something preserved in amber, perfectly visible but impossible to touch. She carried it around in her chest the way you carry a stone you have swallowed too deep to retrieve, too heavy to forget. $12 million could dissolve that stone. $12 million could change everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tom. "Scrapyard guy can come Monday if you want. Just say the word." Clara looked out at the darkness gathering over the harvested fields. Somewhere in that darkness behind the east barn, the combine sat invisible and patient, keeping its secret the way it had kept it for nearly 50 years. She typed her reply to Tom. "Not interested. Thanks." Then she turned off her phone and sat in the rocking chair, feeling the cold seep into her bones, listening to the wind move across the empty fields. She could feel Grandpa Walter's presence in the evening air. Not as a ghost, not as anything supernatural, but as a warmth, a steadiness. The memory of a hand on the steering wheel, firm and sure, guiding her through a turn she was afraid to make on her own. "Trust me, girl, your old grandpa knew what he was doing." She sat on that porch until the stars came out. She sat there until the cold crept deep into her joints, and her fingers were stiff, and her breath hung in white clouds around her face. She was not thinking about $12 million. She was thinking about being 12 years old, sitting on an overturned feed bucket in Grandpa Walter's workshop, watching him bend over a drafting table covered with blueprints. He had been drawing modifications for the combine that day. Improvements to the grain flow system that he wanted to send to International Harvester. Clara had watched his hands move across the paper, the pencil lines precise and confident, each stroke representing a decision about how something should be shaped. "You have the eye, Clara," he had said without looking up. "Most people look at a machine and see parts. You look at it and see how the parts want to be together. That is the difference between a mechanic and an engineer." That was the summer she decided to become an architect. The summer she understood that building things was not just about materials and measurements and math. It was about seeing what something wanted to become and having the courage to help it get there. She was going to need that courage now. The call from Dr. Bellamy came on a Tuesday evening, 11 days after the Saturday appraisal visit. Clara was eating leftover pasta at her kitchen table, the same pasta she had been eating 3 nights in a row when her phone rang. "I've been making discreet inquiries," Dr. Bellamy said. Her voice was careful and measured. "The interest is significant. I spoke with Heritage Auctions in Dallas. They want to handle the sale. They are prepared to set a reserve price of $10 million. $10 million as the floor. As the starting point, based on the documentation in my appraisal, they believe the final hammer price will be substantially higher. They have already identified 8 potential bidders, including 2 major museums and 3 private collectors who have expressed serious interest." Clara's hand tightened around the phone. "That is remarkable." "It is. But Clara, there is something else, something you need to know." Dr. Bellamy paused. "I received a telephone call this afternoon from a lawyer in Indianapolis. A man named Marcus Garrett. He said he was representing your cousin Tom Whitfield, and he was making inquiries about the market value of vintage farm equipment. He did not mention the combine specifically, but the questions he asked were very specific and very pointed. He knew to ask about prototype machinery. He knew to ask about International Harvester." Clara's stomach dropped. The pasta she had been eating turned to cement in her throat. "How would Tom know to call you? I do not know. But somebody told him enough to start looking. And Marcus Garrett is not a general practitioner. He is an estate litigation specialist, one of the best in Indiana." Clara hung up and sat in the silence of her apartment. The overhead light buzzed. The faucet dripped. Her mind raced through scenarios. She thought back to the Saturday of the appraisal. Dr. Bellamy's Pennsylvania plated truck parked in the driveway all morning. the two of them circling the combine for 90 minutes while Dr. Bellamy took photographs and measurements and crouched beside mechanical components with a magnifying glass. It had not been subtle. The farmhouse kitchen window looked directly toward the east barn and the field beyond it. Anyone standing at that window with a cup of morning coffee would have had a clear view. Clara closed her eyes. She had been careless. Grandpa Walter had told her to keep the secret until she was ready, and she had invited a professionally dressed woman with a camera and a leather-bound journal to spend an hour and a half examining the one thing she was supposed to be hiding. She needed to move faster than she had planned. The next morning, she called in sick to work again and drove to the farm before dawn. She arrived at 6:30 before anyone in the farmhouse would be awake. She went straight to the combine with a digital camera and spent 45 minutes photographing every serial number, every identifying mark, every detail that Heritage Auctions would need for registration and cataloging. She photographed the Smithsonian certificate and the original International Harvester purchase documents in natural light. She copied everything onto 2 separate flash drives and mailed the original documents to herself via registered mail at the post office in town. Then she called Heritage Auctions and began the formal consignment process. But she was 3 days too late. The certified letter arrived at her apartment on a Friday afternoon. It was delivered by a courier who required her signature. The envelope bore the letterhead of Garrett and Associates Attorneys at Law, Indianapolis, Indiana. Clara opened it, standing in her doorway. She read it once standing. Then she walked to the kitchen table and sat down and read it again. The letter informed her that her cousins, Diane Whitfield, Tom Whitfield, and Brenda Whitfield, were filing a legal challenge to the last will and testament of Walter Raymond Grayson. The grounds for the challenge were twofold. First, diminished mental capacity. The letter alleged that Walter Grayson had been 89 years old and in declining cognitive health at the time the will was drafted, and that he lacked the legal capacity to make complex decisions about the disposition of valuable assets. Second, undue influence. The letter alleged that Clara Whitfield, as the primary caregiver and most frequent visitor of the deceased, had used her close and exclusive relationship with Walter Grayson to manipulate the terms of the will in her own favor. The letter stated that the petitioners believed the International Harvester combined to be of significant financial value and that the bequest of this asset to a single heir, to the exclusion of the other grandchildren, was inconsistent with the deceased's prior stated intentions and represented evidence of either cognitive impairment or external manipulation. They knew, not everything perhaps, not the exact figures, but they knew enough. Clara called Frank Harmon. "Frank, they are contesting the will." "I received a copy of the filing this morning," Frank said. His voice was calm and deliberate, the voice of a man who had seen every kind of family conflict that money could create. "Clara, this is a serious legal challenge. Diminished capacity cases are difficult to predict. Judges are often sympathetic to families who feel they have been treated unfairly, especially when elderly individuals are involved. Your cousin's attorney is experienced and aggressive. He has won cases like this before. What do I need to do? You need your own attorney, someone who specializes in estate litigation and will contests. And you need evidence as much as you can gather that your grandfather was mentally competent when he drafted the will. Medical records, physician testimony, anything that demonstrates he knew exactly what he was doing and why." Clara hired an estate attorney named Helen Presley. Helen was 54 years old with wire-rimmed glasses, a voice that could cut through steel, and a reputation for being the most tenacious estate litigator in Western Ohio. She reviewed every document, every filing, and every piece of evidence that Clara could provide, and then she gave Clara her assessment over a cup of black coffee at a diner in Dayton. "The will itself is legally sound," Helen said. "Frank Harmon drafted it properly. Witnesses' notarization, all procedural requirements satisfied. But your cousins are not attacking the form of the will. They are attacking the capacity of the testator, and they are attacking your relationship with him. They are going to argue that you had access to a vulnerable, elderly man, and that you used that access to influence his decisions. That is absurd. I loved him. I took care of him because nobody else bothered to show up." Helen looked at her steadily over the rim of her glasses. "I believe you. But in estate law, love and care can be reframed by a skilled attorney as access and undue influence. Your cousins will argue that you were the one who drove him to Frank Harmon's office, that you were present when the will was discussed, that you systematically isolated him from the rest of the family to maintain your influence over his decisions. None of that is true. Can you prove it? Clara spent the following weeks assembling her defense. She obtained Grandpa Walter's medical records from his physician, Dr. James Keating, who had treated him for 20 years. The records included annual cognitive assessments, every one of which Grandpa Walter had passed with scores well above the threshold for mental competency. His most recent assessment, conducted just 4 months before the will was drafted, rated his cognitive function as excellent for his age group. She gathered written statements from neighbors and friends who had interacted with Grandpa Walter regularly up until the week before his death. Hank Dawson, the nearest neighbor, wrote a 2-page letter describing Walter Grayson as the sharpest man I have ever known, still doing the crossword in ink every morning and beating me at chess every Thursday night. The pastor of his church described him as an active, engaged, and intellectually vigorous member of the congregation who had served on the finance committee and taught a Sunday school class on agricultural history right up until his final month. But Marcus Garrett, Tom's attorney, had resources and experience that Clara's defense could not easily match. He found a physician, a Dr. Howard Phelps, who was willing to provide expert testimony that elderly patients could present as cognitively normal in casual social settings while still lacking the specific legal capacity required to make complex financial decisions involving substantial assets. Dr. Phelps had never examined Grandpa Walter. He had never met him. He was offering a general medical opinion, a hypothetical framework that a judge might find convincing enough to cast doubt. The hearing was scheduled for January. Clara had 3 months to prepare. 3 months during which the combine sat in the field exposed to winter weather while its legal status and its ownership hung in suspension. Heritage Auctions informed Clara that they could not proceed with the sale while the will was being contested. The combine was technically part of the disputed estate until a court ruled otherwise. Dr. Bellamy called every week to check on the situation. Her voice grew increasingly concerned with each call. "That machine is sitting out in the open," she said in mid-November. "The temperature fluctuations alone are causing damage. Frost gets into the surface, cracks expands, opens them wider. Every freeze-thaw cycle is degrading the cosmetic condition. If this goes on much longer, the restoration cost will increase significantly." "I know," Clara said. "I am doing everything I can." And then in the first week of December, everything got worse. Clara received a phone call at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. She was in bed, not sleeping, staring at the ceiling, running through legal scenarios in her mind, the way she had done every night for weeks. The phone rang, and the name on the screen was Hank Dawson. "Clara, this is Hank." His voice was rough and urgent and out of breath. "You need to get out here right now. There is a flatbed truck in the back field, and some men are trying to load your grandfather's combine onto it." Clara was on the highway in 4 minutes. She drove 90 miles an hour down the empty interstate, her headlights cutting through the December darkness, her hands gripping the steering wheel with a force that made her forearms ache. She called the county sheriff's department from the road. She called Helen Presley's emergency line. She called Frank Harmon's home phone and let it ring until he answered. When she arrived at the farm, the scene was lit by the headlights of Hank Dawson's truck and the red and blue flashers of a county sheriff's cruiser. A commercial flatbed transport truck was parked in the field next to the combine, its hydraulic loading ramp deployed and resting on the frozen ground. 2 men in coveralls stood beside the ramp looking uncomfortable and confused. Tom stood next to them with his arms folded across his chest and his jaw set in a hard line. The deputy sheriff was a young man in a brown uniform who looked like he had been expecting a quiet night shift. He held a clipboard and looked back and forth between Clara and Tom with the expression of someone who has accidentally walked into someone else's family argument. "That combine is mine," Clara said. Her voice was shaking, but her words were clear. "It was left to me in the will." "The will is being contested," Tom replied. His voice was flat and controlled. "That machine is part of the estate, and until the court rules on its disposition, it should be in secure storage. I was having it moved to a climate-controlled facility for safekeeping." Clara stared at him. "At midnight, without telling me, without telling the court, without telling anyone except the men you hired to load it." Tom said nothing. His jaw worked silently. The deputy held up his clipboard. "I'm going to need you both to step back and settle down." Nobody is moving anything off this property tonight until the legal situation gets sorted out. I've contacted the sheriff, and he says if there's a contested will involved, nobody touches the property in question until a judge says otherwise. The flatbed truck left empty. But Clara did not go home. She sat in her truck in the field, wrapped in a sleeping bag she kept in the back seat for emergencies, and she watched the combine by moonlight. The machine gleamed dully in the cold air frost forming on its metal surfaces like a skin of ice. The temperature was 18 degrees and dropping. She could see her breath in clouds against the windshield. At dawn, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to a private security company in Indianapolis, which agreed to station a guard at the farm around the clock beginning that afternoon. The cost was $200 a day, $1,400 a week, money Clara did not have. She put it on a credit card and tried not to think about the interest rate. The second call was to Helen Presley. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Clara said. "He tried to steal it." "Helen, he tried to take it in the middle of the night." Helen's voice was ice. "I will file an emergency motion for injunctive relief this morning. We will get a court order prohibiting anyone from moving, touching, or interfering with that combine, pending the outcome of the hearing." The court order was granted 2 days later. A judge in Indianapolis signed it without comment. The combine was not to be moved, altered, or accessed by anyone except Clara Whitfield and her authorized agents until the estate dispute was resolved. But the damage to the family was already done. The relationship between Clara and her cousins, which had been strained since the will reading, was now openly hostile. Diane sent Clara a text message that said, "You are tearing this family apart over a piece of junk." Tom did not communicate at all, except through his attorney. Brenda, caught between sides, stopped responding to messages entirely. Clara spent the next 2 weeks driving back and forth between Dayton and the farm, checking on the security guard, checking on the combine, checking on the slow erosion of everything Grandpa Walter had built. One Saturday in mid-December, she drove to the farm and relieved the guard for a few hours. She climbed up onto the combine's platform and sat in the old driver's seat. The vinyl was cracked and split by decades of exposure, the stuffing showing through in gray tufts, but the seat still held her weight. From up here, she could see the whole farm. The fields running to the tree line, the farmhouse on the hill, the barns and silos standing like sentries against the gray winter sky. She missed Grandpa Walter with an ache that was physical, that sat in her chest like a fist pressing against her ribs. She missed his voice, his stories, his steady certainty that things would work out if you did the right thing and had the patience to wait for the world to catch up. She climbed down from the cab and walked around the machine one more time, running her bare hand along the cold metal, feeling the texture of rust and paint and history beneath her fingertips. As she reached the rear of the combine near the base of the cab frame, her fingers found something unexpected. A seam in the metal that did not match the machine's original construction. It was in the underside of the cab, mounting hidden from view, unless you were crouching low and looking up at an angle. Clara got down on her back on the frozen ground and slid under the machine, ignoring the cold that bit through her jacket and the rust flakes that fell onto her face. The seam outlined a small rectangular panel about 6 inches by 4 inches recessed into the frame. It was held in place by 2 bolts that were different from every other bolt on the machine. These bolts were stainless steel, bright and uncorroded, clearly installed much more recently than the machine's original hardware. She retrieved a socket wrench from the security guard's truck and removed the bolts with hands that were shaking from both cold and anticipation. The panel came free with a soft, metallic click. Behind it was a small, waterproof bag, the kind sold at camping supply stores for protecting electronics from rain. Inside the bag were 2 items, a USB flash drive and a handwritten note on a folded piece of lined paper. "Clara, if you found this, then things have gotten complicated. I knew they would. I know my grandchildren better than they know themselves. Play the video on this drive. It is my insurance policy for you. I recorded it on July 14th of this year, with Frank Harmon present as witness. Use it when you need it, and remember what I always told you. You are braver than you think. You always have been. Love, Grandpa Walter." Clara drove straight to Frank Harmon's office. He was in a meeting, but his secretary took one look at Clara's face and interrupted it. Frank confirmed that he had been present when the video was recorded. He had not known where Walter planned to hide the flash drive. He was concerned about a legal challenge, Frank said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. He told me last spring that he expected his other grandchildren to contest the will once they discovered the combine's real value. He said they would claim he was senile. He said they would try to take it from you. He wanted to make absolutely certain that you had proof of his intentions. They played the video on Frank's office computer. Grandpa Walter appeared on screen sitting in the rocking chair on the farmhouse porch. The date stamp in the corner read July 14th. It had been recorded 4 months before his death. His hair was white and thin, his face deeply lined by 89 years of sun and wind and work, but his eyes were clear and blue and absolutely steady. He was wearing the flannel shirt Clara remembered, the green and black one with the missing button on the left cuff. Behind him, the farm spread out in full summer glory, the fields green and lush, the sky enormous and blue. Frank Harmon was visible in the corner of the frame, sitting in a straight-backed wooden chair with a legal pad on his knee and a pen in his hand. Grandpa Walter looked directly into the camera. His gaze was unwavering. "My name is Walter Raymond Grayson," he said. His voice was strong and clear and unhurried, the voice of a man who had something important to say and intended to say it without rushing. "I am 89 years old. Today is July the 14th, and I am recording this video of my own free will in full possession of my mental faculties, with my attorney Frank Harmon present as a witness." He paused, not for effect, but to let the words settle. "I know what is going to happen after I die. My grandchildren are going to fight over my combine, not because they care about the machine, not because they have ever shown the slightest interest in agricultural history or engineering innovation, or the things I spent my life working on. They are going to fight because they will eventually figure out what it is worth. And when they do, they are going to try to take it from Clara." He leaned forward slightly in the rocking chair. "So let me be perfectly clear about something. I am leaving the International Harvester, 1480 Combine Serial Number 001, to my granddaughter Clara Whitfield, because she is the only one of my grandchildren who deserves it. Not because she is perfect, not because she has never made a mistake, but because she is the only one who showed up. Every summer, every harvest, every time I needed help or company, or just the sound of a friendly voice, Clara was there. She drove 3 hours each way. She slept in the guest room with the leaky window. She got up at 5 in the morning and helped me in the fields without being asked. The others came for Christmas dinner and left before the dishes were washed." His voice softened but did not waver. "Clara gave up her dream of becoming an architect to take care of her mother when nobody else in this family would lift a finger. She dropped out of college, took a job she did not want, and spent 3 years of her life driving her mother to cancer treatments while the rest of my grandchildren found reasons to be busy. She never asked for a single thing in return. She never complained. She never said, 'Why does it have to be me?' She just did what needed to be done because that is who Clara is. That is who she has always been." He straightened in the rocking chair and his eyes hardened. "Now, if any of my other grandchildren are watching this video, then they have filed some kind of legal challenge against my will. And if they have done that, then I want them to hear this directly from me. I love you all. I have always loved you. But love does not mean I am blind. I have watched you for 40 years, and I know exactly who you are. Diane, you are smart and capable, but you have always believed that the world owes you something. Tom, you are hardworking, but you have never understood the difference between value and price. Brenda, you are kind at heart, but you follow whoever is loudest instead of whoever is right. Clara is the only one I trust with this. And if you are trying to take it from her, then you are proving me right." He smiled, a slow, crooked, slightly mischievous smile that made Clara's heart crack open in Frank Harmon's office. "One more thing. If anyone is contesting this will on the grounds that I was not of sound mind, I would like to direct their attention to the following facts. This morning I completed the New York Times crossword puzzle in ink in 22 minutes with no errors. Last Tuesday I beat Frank Harmon at chess in 17 moves. And I can recite from memory the serial numbers of every piece of farm equipment I have owned in the past 60 years in chronological order, which I will now do." He proceeded to recite without hesitation 19 serial numbers, each one precise, each one correct. Frank Harmon, visible in the corner of the frame, shook his head slowly, throughout the recitation the expression of a man who has been beaten at chess too many times by the same opponent. When Walter finished, he looked into the camera one final time. "Clara, build something beautiful. That is all I have ever wanted for you." The video ended. Clara sat in Frank Harmon's office with tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving with the effort of containing the sound that was trying to come out of her. Frank handed her a box of tissues and said nothing for a very long time. He did not need to. They both understood what they had just watched. It was not just a legal document. It was a love letter disguised as an insurance policy. When Clara could speak again, she said, "Will this hold up?" Frank nodded slowly, carefully, the way a man nods when he is certain, but understands the weight of what he is affirming. "I believe it will more than hold up. But let your attorney make the final determination." Helen Presley watched the video 3 times. After the third viewing, she closed her laptop and sat in silence for exactly 10 seconds. Then she picked up the phone and called Marcus Garrett's office. The meeting between Helen Presley and Marcus Garrett took place in a conference room in Indianapolis on a Tuesday afternoon in late December. It lasted less than 40 minutes. Marcus Garrett watched the video once. He asked 2 questions. The first was about the date stamp. The second was about Frank Harmon's presence as a witness. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. He told Helen that he would strongly advise his clients to withdraw the challenge. The case was formally dismissed in the first week of January. The presiding judge noted in her ruling that the video evidence demonstrated beyond any reasonable question that Walter Raymond Grayson had been of sound mind, clear intention, and full awareness of both the value and the historical significance of his bequest to Clara Whitfield at the time the will was drafted and executed. Tom did not call Clara after the ruling. Neither did Diane. Brenda sent a text message that said simply, "Sorry." Clara read the message and set her phone down on the kitchen table and did not reply. She did not know what to say. She did not know if there was anything left to say. She was already focused on what came next. The restoration began in late January and took 7 weeks. Clara hired Heartland Vintage Machinery, a specialty firm based in Milwaukee that had restored equipment for the Smithsonian, the Henry Ford Museum, and half a dozen major private collections. The firm sent a team of 4 technicians to transport the combine on a custom climate-controlled trailer, handling it with the care and reverence of museum conservators moving a priceless masterpiece. The work was painstaking. Every component was documented, photographed from multiple angles, and cataloged in a digital archive before any cleaning or restoration began. Rust was removed using chemical treatments rather than abrasives to preserve original machining, marks, and tool patterns. The paint was matched to International Harvester's exact factory specifications from 1975, using samples taken from protected areas of the machine where the original color had survived beneath layers of grime. Chrome and nickel accents were replated by hand. Electrical systems were rewired with period-correct components. Hydraulic lines were rebuilt. The engine, which had not turned over in decades, was disassembled, cleaned, reassembled, and brought back to running condition. The cost was $52,000. Dr. Bellamy told Clara it would be the best investment she ever made. When the restoration was complete, Clara drove to Milwaukee to see the machine. She stood in the doorway of the Heartland workshop and stopped breathing. The combine looked like it had rolled off the production line that morning. Its red paint gleamed under the workshop lights, deep and rich and vivid. The International Harvester logos stood out crisp and sharp on both sides of the grain tank white letters against red enamel, looking exactly as they had in the 1975 factory photographs that Clara had found in Grandpa Walter's box. The chrome accents caught the overhead light like mirrors. The massive tires were new reproductions made from the original mold specifications, their treads deep and black and clean. And the serial number plate IH1 480001 had been polished to a soft gleam and mounted in its original position on the lower frame, a small rectangle of metal that represented the beginning of an era. Clara walked around the machine slowly, the way Dr. Bellamy had walked around it in the field. She touched the panels, the chrome, the logos. She climbed up into the restored cab and sat in the driver's seat, which had been recovered in vinyl that matched the original specification. From up here, the view through the cab windows was the view her grandfather had seen every day for 2 growing seasons. The view of a man sitting inside the future of agriculture, looking out at the fields he had helped to feed. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry. She had done enough crying. What she felt was not sadness, but something else. Something large and warm and structural, like a foundation being poured, like the first wall of a building going up. Heritage Auctions scheduled the sale for the third Saturday in March. The catalog listing ran to 4 full pages of text illustrations and provenance documentation. Lot number 47, 1975, an International Harvester model, 1480 prototype combine harvester. Serial number IH-1480-001, the first of its kind, the machine that changed agriculture. The pre-auction publicity campaign generated interest that exceeded even Dr. Bellamy's most optimistic projections. Farming magazines ran feature articles. The History Channel aired a special segment. 3 major newspapers published stories about the combine and the woman who had found its secret. Social media accounts dedicated to vintage machinery and agricultural history shared photographs that were viewed millions of times. The auction was held in a grand ballroom at a hotel in Des Moines, Iowa. Clara arrived 2 hours early and found the room already filling with potential buyers. Museum representatives with institutional authorization badges and cellular phones connected to board members waiting in conference rooms in distant cities. Private collectors in expensive suits, their financial advisors sitting beside them with laptops open to brokerage accounts. Journalists and photographers jostling for position along the side walls. Television cameras from 3 networks. The combine sat on a raised display platform in the center of the room, lit by spotlights that had been positioned to show it to maximum effect. Its red paint glowed under the lights. Its chrome caught every flash from every camera. A large placard mounted on an easel beside the platform told the machine's story in careful, precise language, accompanied by historical photographs from International Harvester's archives. Clara stood at the back of the room in a navy blue dress she had bought for the occasion. It was the most expensive piece of clothing she had ever owned. Her hands were shaking. Dr. Bellamy stood beside her in a gray suit, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes bright with the barely contained excitement of a woman who had spent 30 years working toward a moment like this. The auctioneer took the podium. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a commanding presence and a voice that reached every corner of the room without amplification. Ladies and gentlemen, lot number 47, we have before us a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the 1975 International Harvester Model 1480 Prototype Combine Harvester, serial number 001. The very first combine ever manufactured to incorporate the revolutionary axial flow rotary threshing system that became the worldwide industry standard. Authenticated by the Smithsonian Institution. Documented with complete provenance from the date of manufacture to the present day. Professionally restored to original factory condition by Heartland Vintage Machinery of Milwaukee. He paused and let his gaze sweep the room. There is only one of these machines in existence. There will never be another. What you are looking at is not merely a piece of equipment. It is a piece of American history. It is the moment when agricultural technology leaped forward by a generation. Every modern combine harvester on every farm on every continent can trace its lineage back to this machine. He settled his hands on the podium. Bidding will open at $5 million. $5 million. A paddle went up immediately in the third row, then another near the middle, then 3 more in rapid succession along the right side of the room. $6 million the auctioneer called. $7 million. The numbers climbed with a velocity that made Clara's vision narrow. $8 million. A man in the third row identified by Dr. Bellamy in a whisper as a representative of a major automotive museum in Detroit. $9 million. A woman near the front, a private collector from Connecticut known for assembling one of the largest vintage machinery collections in the world. $10 million. The museum representative from Detroit, his voice steady and professional. $11 million. A new bidder, a representative from the National Museum of American History in Washington, speaking into a phone with one hand and raising his paddle with the other. $12 million. The Connecticut collector. Her voice tight with determination, her financial advisor leaning close and whispering in her ear. The room was electric. Clara could feel the energy pressing against her skin, a physical force that hummed and crackled in the air. Her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid the people standing near her could hear it. Beside her, Dr. Bellamy gripped her arm. $12 million going once the auctioneer intoned. $12,500,000. Detroit coming back with a counterbid that drew a murmur from the crowd. $13 million. The National Museum representative, after a long consultation by phone with someone who was presumably sitting in an office somewhere in Washington, authorizing the expenditure of taxpayer money on a rusted farm machine that had been sitting in a field in Indiana. The Connecticut collector shook her head slowly and lowered her paddle. Her financial advisor closed his laptop with a click that was audible in the suddenly quiet room. Two bidders remaining. 13,500,000 called Detroit. 14 million countered the National Museum. Clara watched the numbers climb past every estimate, past every projection, past every figure she had allowed herself to imagine during those long nights in her apartment, eating leftover pasta and calculating how many months of rent she could pay if she sold the combine for scrap. 14,500,000. 15 million. The room held its breath. 15,500,000. Detroit, his voice strained now, the casual professionalism giving way to the raw urgency of a man who is approaching his limit and knows it. 16 million, a new voice, not Detroit, not the National Museum, someone else entirely. The voice came from the back of the room near the entrance, and every head in the ballroom turned to find its source. A man Clara had not noticed before was standing near the rear doors. He was in his late 50s, solidly built with a weathered face and broad shoulders that suggested years spent outdoors. He wore a charcoal suit and a tie the color of ripe wheat. His voice when he spoke carried the unhurried confidence of a man who does not bid unless he intends to win. 16 million, he said again, and the number settled over the room like a stone dropping into still water. The Detroit representative consulted with his phone. The conversation was brief and evidently unsatisfying. He lowered his paddle. $16 million, the auctioneer said, his own voice betraying the slightest tremor of excitement. Going once. The room was silent. Going twice. Clara held her breath. Sold. For $16 million. The room erupted. Applause and gasps and the machine gun clicking of cameras and the surge of reporters toward the winning bidder and the roar of voices trying to be heard above each other. Clara stood perfectly still, her hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Bellamy had both arms around her and was saying something, but Clara could not hear the words over the sound of her own blood rushing through her ears. The man in the charcoal suit made his way through the crowd toward Clara. Up close, his eyes were blue and penetrating, and the lines around them spoke of decades of squinting into prairie sunlight and plains wind. His handshake was firm and warm and deliberate. "You are Clara Whitfield," he said. It was not a question. "I am. My name is Nathan Caldwell. I am the president and founder of the Caldwell Foundation for Agricultural Education." He held Clara's hand a moment longer than a business handshake required. "Your grandfather and I were friends." Clara stared at him. "You knew Grandpa Walter." Nathan Caldwell's face softened. "He was my professor," he said, "at Purdue in the fall of 1993. I was a 20-year-old farm kid from a cattle operation outside Kearney, Nebraska. I had a scholarship to study agricultural engineering, but I did not have the first idea what I was doing. I was failing 2 classes and thinking about dropping out and going home to work cattle." He paused, and the noise of the crowd seemed to recede around them, as though the two of them were standing in a pocket of stillness that the chaos could not reach. "Your grandfather was teaching a guest seminar on agricultural machinery design, a 2-week intensive course. I almost did not sign up for it. A friend talked me into it, and on the first day, Walter Grayson walked into the lecture hall and changed my life. He saw something in me." Nathan continued, "Something I did not see in myself. He pulled me aside after the second class and told me I had a mind for systems. He said I could see how parts fit together." Those were his exact words. After the seminar ended, he kept in touch. He called me every month. He wrote me letters, actual handwritten letters with diagrams in the margins. He reviewed my senior thesis. He wrote my graduate school recommendations. He mentored me for 3 years, and he never asked for anything in return. Nathan looked at the combine gleaming red and magnificent under the auction lights. "I built the Caldwell Foundation because of what Walter Grayson taught me. We fund agricultural education programs in rural communities across the country. We bring machinery and technology to schools in small towns so farm kids can see what is possible beyond their own fence lines. When I heard that Walter's combine was going to auction, I knew what I had to do. I knew what he would have wanted." He turned back to Clara. "We are going to restore this machine to full working condition. We are going to build a traveling exhibit around it, and tour it across the country to county fairs and state fairs and schools and community centers and anywhere else where children can climb on it and learn about how one engineer's innovation changed the way the world eats. Your grandfather's name will be on every exhibit panel, every educational program, every piece of material we produce. The Walter Grayson Combine, the machine that changed agriculture. Clara could not speak. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt her heart beating against her palm. He talked about you constantly, Nathan said, his voice dropping low. In every conversation we ever had over 30 years, your name came up. Clara is the one he used to say. She has the builder's eye. She just needs the chance. After taxes and auction commissions and restoration costs and legal fees and the security guard's invoices and Helen Presley's bill and all the other expenses that had accumulated over 5 months of discovery and defense and determination, Clara Whitfield walked away from the Heritage Auctions office in Des Moines with a cashier's check for $12,214,000, more money than she had imagined was possible for a person like her. A woman who ate the same pasta 3 nights in a row and drove a pickup truck with 200,000 miles on the odometer and had not bought a new pair of shoes in 2 years. She deposited the check at her bank in Dayton on a Monday morning. The teller looked at the amount, looked at Clara, looked at the amount again, and then very carefully asked Clara to have a seat while she got the branch manager. The first thing Clara did with the money was establish the Walter Grayson Memorial Scholarship Fund. She endowed it with $2 million invested in a conservative portfolio that would generate income sufficient to fund its mission in perpetuity. The scholarships would go to students from small farming communities who wanted to study agricultural engineering, sustainable farming practices, rural community development, or any field related to feeding the world and caring for the land. The fund would support 50 students per year, every year, for as long as the endowment lasted, which, if the investments performed as projected, would be forever. She called it the Builder Scholarship, because Grandpa Walter had always said that the world needed more people who built things and fewer people who just watched. The second thing she did was buy a piece of land, 20 acres in the rolling hills of southern Indiana, 45 minutes from Grandpa Walter's farm. The property had a modest house on it, a 2-bedroom farmhouse with hardwood floors and a kitchen with large windows that looked out over open fields and a tree line that turned golden red in autumn. It was nothing extravagant, nothing ostentatious. The house needed work. New roof, updated plumbing, fresh paint, and Clara intended to do most of it herself. But the property had something that mattered to Clara more than granite countertops or square footage. It had a workshop, a large, solidly built outbuilding with high ceilings and east-facing windows that let in the morning light. The previous owner had used it for woodworking, and the space still smelled faintly of sawdust and linseed oil. Clara set up the workshop carefully, deliberately, the way Grandpa Walter had set up his. She positioned a drafting table beside the largest window where the light was best. She installed tool racks on the walls and organized them by function. She bought a workbench made of solid maple from an estate sale, surface scarred and stained from years of honest use, and she placed it in the center of the room where she could walk around it from every angle. She enrolled in an online architecture program through a university in Columbus, not because she needed credentials, not because she was trying to prove something to anyone, but because she had made a promise to an old man that she would build something beautiful, and she wanted to learn how to do it properly. The third thing she did was nothing. For 3 full weeks, she did nothing at all. She sat in her new house and looked out the windows at the fields. She walked her 20 acres and learned the names of the birds in the hedgerows and the wildflowers along the fence line. She cooked meals from scratch and ate them at a pace she chose herself, not the frantic 10-minute lunches she had eaten at her desk at the valve company for 15 years. She slept 8 hours a night for the first time since her mother got sick. She was not being lazy. She was doing something she had never done before. She was learning how to live without the weight. Her cousins barely spoke to her in the months that followed the auction. Tom sent a single text message 3 days after the sale was reported in the local news. "Congratulations." The period at the end of the word hit Clara like a small, precise blow. She could feel the bitterness compressed into that punctuation mark like a fist clenched tight. Diane sent nothing. No text, no call, no email. A wall of silence that was louder than any words she could have chosen. Brenda sent an Easter card, a generic one from a drugstore rack with no personal message written inside. Just her signature. Just her name. Clara put the card on her refrigerator and looked at it sometimes and tried to feel something other than sadness. She did not blame them. She understood the arithmetic of resentment. Three cousins who had inherited assets worth a combined total of roughly $2.5 million and who had considered themselves the winners of the inheritance equation now had to live with the knowledge that the fourth cousin, the one they had pitied, the one who got the worthless machine, had walked away with $12 million. It did not feel fair, not from the outside, not through the lens of money, which was the only lens they had ever learned to use. But Grandpa Walter had not been interested in fairness. He had been interested in something more precise and more demanding than fairness. He had been interested in trust. And trust, unlike money, could not be divided equally. It went to whoever had earned it. 6 months after the auction, Clara received a package in the mail. A large manila envelope with no return address, just a postmark from Lincoln, Nebraska. Inside was a photograph and a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery. The photograph showed the combine. It was sitting on a display platform at a county fair draped in red and white bunting that matched its paint. The platform was surrounded by children, dozens of them ages 5 to 15, climbing on the treads, sitting in the cab, reaching up to touch the grain tank with small outstretched hands. Their faces were incandescent with wonder, the kind of open-mouthed, wide-eyed, full-body wonder that only comes from encountering something genuinely extraordinary for the first time. In the background of the photograph, a large banner read, "The Walter Grayson Combine, the machine that changed agriculture." A Caldwell Foundation educational exhibit. The note was handwritten in a steady, careful hand. Dear Clara, your grandfather's machine inspired over 4,000 visitors at the Nebraska State Fair this week. 13 schools that have already booked educational visits for the fall semester. We have received 270 applications for the Caldwell Foundation's Young Engineers Program, which we are launching in partnership with the Walter Grayson Memorial Scholarship Fund. I thought you should know that your grandfather's legacy is reaching people he never met, in places he never visited, in ways he probably never imagined. But then again, knowing Walter, he probably did imagine it. He was always thinking 3 steps ahead. Thank you for making sure this machine ended up where it could do the most good. With gratitude, Nathan Caldwell. Clara hung the photograph in her workshop. She placed it on the wall above her drafting table, next to a photograph she had found in Grandpa Walter's box of documents. The old photograph showed Clara at 12 years old standing beside the combine in the summer sun. She was grinning so wide her eyes were nearly closed, her hair messy from the wind, her clothes dusty from a day in the fields. Grandpa Walter stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, but he was not looking at the camera. He was looking at Clara. And the expression on his face, which Clara had not been old enough to read at 12 but could read perfectly now at 44, was not pride exactly. It was certainty. The quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at and exactly what it would become. 1 year after the auction, Clara drove back to the farm for Thanksgiving. It was Diane who called. Her voice on the phone had been stiff, at first formal, and guarded the voice of a woman speaking to someone she was not sure she wanted to speak to. But by the end of the 3-minute conversation, something had softened in her tone. A crack in the wall. A loosening of the mortar. It is not the same without everyone here, Diane said. Grandpa would have wanted us together. Clara arrived at the farmhouse in the late morning, driving her truck up the gravel road, past the bare November fields, and the familiar fence lines in the east barn where the combine had once sat. She carried a pecan pie she had baked from Grandpa Walter's recipe written on a yellowed index card in her grandmother's handwriting, with the margins full of Grandpa Walter's annotations in blue ink. More butter, less sugar, do not rush the crust. Clara, the crust is everything. The farmhouse was warm and bright and filled with the smell of roasting turkey and something cinnamon. Diane had set the long dining table with the good china, the set with the blue cornflower pattern that had belonged to their grandmother. Brenda was in the kitchen basting the turkey and singing along to a country station on the radio. The house felt for the first time in over a year like it belonged to a family rather than a legal dispute. Tom was on the front porch sitting in a chair with a beer in his hand, staring out at the fields. He looked thinner than Clara remembered. Older. There were shadows under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. the look of a man carrying something heavy that he had not figured out how to put down. Clara, he said when she stepped onto the porch. He did not smile, but his voice contained no hostility, just a weariness that was close to sadness. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, looking out at the farm. The November wind moved across the harvested fields, bending the dead grass in long, slow waves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The dinner conversation was careful at first, polite and measured everyone, stepping around the obvious subjects the way you navigate a room in the dark, hands out, feeling for obstacles. The auction was not mentioned. The lawsuit was not mentioned. The combine was not mentioned. They talked about weather and football and Brenda's daughter's school play and the new roof that Diane was planning to put on the farmhouse. But as the meal progressed and the wine was poured and the pecan pie was served, the edges began to soften. Something in the ritual of sitting around a table together, eating food from a recipe written by the dead, unlocked a door that all four of them had been keeping closed. Remember when Grandpa tried to teach us all to square dance in the barn, Brenda said, and she was laughing before she finished the sentence. He was so terrible at it. He kept stepping on his own feet and apologizing to the hay bales. He was the worst dancer I have ever seen. Diane agreed, and she was smiling now too, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her face look younger and softer. But he never let that stop him. He would just laugh and say, the feet are not the important part. The music is the important part. He never let anything stop him, Tom said quietly. The table went still. Tom was looking down at his plate, turning his fork slowly between his fingers. He did not look up, but Clara could see the muscles working in his jaw. After dinner, Clara walked out to the back field behind the east barn. The space where the combine had stood for nearly 50 years was empty. Just brown grass and bare earth and the Washby, Indiana sky stretching to the horizon. The rectangular patch where the massive tires had compressed the soil for so long was still visible, a faint geometric scar on the ground. Nothing grew there yet. The earth was still recovering from the weight of what it had held. Clara stood in the center of the empty space and let the wind move around her. She could feel the absence of the machine like a presence, the ghost of red metal, the memory of rust and secrets, and the sound of a screwdriver working around hidden clips on a cold October night. I still cannot believe it. Tom's voice came from behind her. She turned and found him walking across the field, his hands deep in his jacket pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the empty ground. $16 million, he said, for that old machine. It was never about the money, Clara said. Tom was quiet for a long time. The wind pushed at them cold and stay-rowdy, carrying the smell of frozen earth and distant wood smoke. Then he said something Clara did not expect. Do you remember what I wanted to do when I was 18? Clara looked at him. She did remember. She remembered it clearly because it was one of the memories that had survived intact from the time when they were all young and the future was still a wide-open space full of possibility instead of a narrow corridor lined with compromises. You wanted to study veterinary medicine, she said. You wanted to be a large animal vet. You were going to help farmers take care of their livestock. You used to talk about it every summer. You had brochures from Purdue's vet school spread all over the guest room floor. Tom's face changed. The hardness that had been there for over a year, the set jaw and the flat eyes, and the tension in the muscles around his mouth cracked. And what showed through the crack was not anger or resentment. It was grief. The old deep, quiet grief of a man looking at a road he did not take and understanding perhaps for the first time the full weight of what that choice had cost him. I could not afford it, he said. His voice was rough. Vet school was 6 years, and Dad needed me on the farm. Grandpa needed me. And then I was 30, and it was too late. And then I was 40, and it was way too late. Clara reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pulled out an envelope she had been carrying for 3 weeks. She had put it in her coat before leaving her house that morning. She had checked twice during the drive to make sure it was still there. She had rehearsed what she would say and then thrown out the rehearsal because this was not a speech. This was a gift. The Walter Grayson Memorial Scholarship is not just for 18-year-olds, she said. She held the envelope out to him. We are launching an adult learner program in January. Full tuition, full cost of books and materials, living expense stipend, everything. For people from farming backgrounds who had a dream they could not afford to chase. Tom stared at the envelope. The application form was visible through the unsealed flap. He did not take it. He just stared at it, and Clara watched the war in his face between pride and longing, between the man he had become and the boy he had been, between the voice that said it was too late and the voice that said it was never too late. Clara, I am 45 years old. Clara did not lower the envelope. She held it steady, and she looked at her cousin, and she said, "So what? You think it is too late to become who you were supposed to be?" Tom's eyes filled. He blinked hard and looked away out across the empty field toward the tree line and the darkening sky. His throat worked. His hands came out of his pockets and hung at his sides, and Clara could see them shaking. He took the envelope. He held it against his chest, with both hands pressing it flat over his heart, and he stood there in the cold wind with tears running down his weathered face and his lips pressed tight together. "I do not know what to say," he managed. "Say you will think about it. That is all I am asking." He nodded. Once, a single sharp downward motion of his head. Then he opened his mouth and closed it again. Then he said, "I am sorry, Clara, about the lawsuit, about the truck at midnight, about all of it. I was scared and I was angry, and I did not understand what Grandpa was doing. I thought he was punishing me. I thought he thought I was not good enough." Clara looked at her cousin. She saw the boy he had been at 18 sprawled on the guest room floor, with veterinary school brochures spread around him like a map of a future he believed in. She saw the man he had become, strong and capable and trapped, working land he loved, but had never chosen, living a life that fit him like someone else's coat. Grandpa did not think that, Clara said. He knew who you were, Tom. He knew all of us. He just knew that different people need different things. You needed the land, Diane needed the house, Brenda needed the equipment, and I needed the combine. Why did you need that machine? Because it taught me something he had been trying to tell me my whole life. That the most valuable things do not always look valuable. That sometimes you have to dig past the rust to find what matters. That the people who show up, who keep showing up even when nobody thanks them and nobody notices and the work is hard and the reward is invisible, those are the people who deserve the treasure. She paused, and because he knew I would share it, Tom pressed the envelope tighter against his chest. He looked at Clara for a long moment, and something passed between them that was older and deeper than the argument, older than the auction, older than the will. It was the thing that had connected them when they were children running through these same fields. Before money, before property, before the complicated machinery of adulthood had made them strangers. He turned and they walked back toward the farmhouse together. The lights were on in every window, warm and golden, and through the glass, Clara could see Diane and Brenda moving around the kitchen, washing dishes and putting away food, their movements falling into the unconscious, synchronized rhythm of family. As they reached the porch steps, Tom stopped. "Clara." She turned. "Thank you," he said, and he was not talking about the scholarship. Clara stepped onto the porch and sat down in Grandpa Walter's rocking chair, the same chair where he had recorded his video, the same chair where she had read his letter on the night that she discovered what the combine was worth, the same chair where he had sat for 60 years watching the sun set over the fields, thinking about machines and history and the granddaughter he trusted with his greatest secret. The stars were coming out, the same stars that had been there on the October night when she drove to the farm with her headlights off and pried open a hidden panel with a screwdriver. The same stars that Grandpa Walter had watched from this same chair for as long as Clara had been alive and longer. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph Nathan Caldwell had sent her. The combine at the county fair, surrounded by children gleaming red in the Nebraska sunlight, alive again. She thought about what Nathan had said at the auction. He was always thinking 3 steps ahead. 3 steps. The combine, the secret, the video, the scholarship, the foundation, the children climbing on a machine that had once been the most worthless thing in a dead man's estate. It was all connected, every piece fitting into every other piece, like the components of a machine designed by a man who understood that the parts are never just parts. They are a system, and the system only works when everything is in the right place. Grandpa Walter had not left her a broken combine. He had left her a blueprint, a design for a life. A set of instructions hidden in metal and rust and paper and love for how to take something that looked worthless and turn it into something that mattered. Clara rocked slowly in the old chair, listening to the wind and the distant sound of her cousins' voices from inside the warm house. She looked up at the stars and she could hear his voice, not as a memory, not as something she was trying to recall, but as a living thing, a voice that had become so much a part of her that she could not tell where it ended. And she began. Sometimes the most valuable things look worthless to everyone else. Trust me, girl, your old grandpa knew what he was doing. And sitting there on that cold November evening, with the stars burning above her, and the empty fields stretching out before her, and the warmth of family spilling through the farmhouse windows behind her, Clara Whitfield understood fully and finally, and with a certainty that went all the way down to her bones, that Walter Raymond Grayson had known exactly what he was doing. He always had.